Thanks for joining us, everybody, to our statewide pink webinar. I'd like to thank our co-host, Eastern New York Commercial Hort Program, Mike Bastow and Dan Donahue, the rest of my team, Mara Miranda Sazo, Janet Van Zoren, and Liz T. This is something we've probably done 3 or 4 years running now to do the whole statewide. And just a reminder for folks to mute your devices. That would be very, very helpful. And questions, you can put your questions in the chat box, and then hopefully there'll be a little bit of time after each presentation to unmute yourself and to ask questions as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Mario to introduce the first couple of speakers, and I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you, folks.
So we would like to invite Professor Terence Robinson to talk about crop load management. Professor Robinson, you can go ahead and share your presentation.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here again to talk about thinning suggestions that I might suggest for you this year. I've made this presentation just a series of suggestions. We all have to deal with results of last night. I'm not going to deal with it at all in my presentation, but I'll just comment that I like to wait a few days and get a more measured response. But nevertheless, it will impact our thinning decisions this year. But the first suggestion I have for you this year is that you should evaluate each variety, each block for blossom load at pink. And there's 2 rules I want to propose for you this year, and that is if the number of blossom clusters on spurs, and I'm talking only about spurs, not about blossoms on 1-year wood, if that number of blossom clusters is greater than your target final fruit number per tree, then I think you should plan an aggressive multiple spray program with a bloom spray or 2 bloom sprays followed by a petal fall spray and then an 11 to 12 millimeter spray. We hope that that will accomplish all the thinning. Now with the frost, there may be lots of other considerations, but we'll address those at thinning meetings as we get closer to the moment of putting these sprays on. But a second situation where there's variable bloom is if the number of flower clusters per tree is less than the target fruit number, then plan a relatively conservative thinning program of a single spray timed at 11 to 12 millimeters. And many varieties that aren't hard to thin or that aren't extremely biennial can be thinned with a single spray at that time. But the main point is that the number of clusters you start with is an important factor in determining how aggressive you want to be with your thinning program. Now in 2025, we again had great evidence of the value of this multiple sprays, sequential sprays. I'll just use Western New York as an example. In 2025, we had a thinning meeting. I remember particularly being west of Rochester at Lamont Fruit Farms around the petal fall timing, and it looked like from the carbohydrate balance model that was the best time to thin, and people should have been out thinning instead of there listening to me at this meeting. Many people went right home and thinned as quickly as they could, but couldn't get over their whole orchard before conditions didn't turn out to be favorable. As we went forward and got to the normal 10 to 12 millimeter timing, conditions were terrible, meaning we had a carbohydrate surplus. And then they said, well, we'll bank on a rescue thinning spray at 16 to 18 millimeters, but conditions were also terrible. And so it turned out that almost the entire thinning that we got last year in Western New York in many blocks was from the petal fall spray. And so if you miss that or you don't put any effort into blossom thinning, you could get caught like we were last year with terrible carbohydrate balance conditions at the later timings, which we used to rely on so much. My second suggestion is that for biennial bearing cultivars, I think it's essential that we apply blossom sprays. And I'm suggesting here that the best approach are 2 sprays of a caustic blossom thinning product, timing them using the pollen tube growth model. Now, we began work with both ATS and lime sulfur in 2005, more than 20 years ago. And for many of those years, I've compared ATS versus lime sulfur and oil. And almost always, the best thinning comes from lime sulfur and oil, with inferior thinning from ATS. Now, because we've not had lime sulfur registered in New York, I've emphasized in all the intervening years to spray with ATS. A number of people have been fairly successful with ATS, but this year, and starting last year, with the registration of the Miller brand of lime sulfur and a dormant oil like NAM oil, the two combined can give superior thinning with hard to thin varieties, particularly the biennial ones like Fuji and Honeycrisp, but also the hard to thin ones like Gala. I show here in the graph just data from a trial I ran last year. It was with Gala. The unthinned control in the first block ended up with about 270 fruits. And if you look across, if we sprayed with ATS in the third bar, no thinning, NAA at bloom, no thinning. Where we got thinning was with lime sulfur and oil. Now, if we combine lime sulfur and oil with a later 10 millimeter spray of Maxellin 7, we didn't get much additional thinning because of those carbohydrate conditions at 10 to 12 millimeters, so that we got most of the thinning, in this case, from a blossom spray. In this experiment, we did not include a petal fall spray. But this is typical of the data, that we continue to see better thinning of lime sulfur and oil. And it's kind of a newer thing for some of you because it hasn't been labeled. Maybe you're more comfortable with ATS. But I'm suggesting if you've got strong bloom on Honeycrisp, strong bloom on Gala, that you use lime sulfur and oil this year, and I'll give you the specific rates in just a minute. Now, the other reason why bloom thinning is so important is my third bulleted point. The gibberellins that seeds produce inhibit flower formation for the next year. And the earlier you can get those extra fruits off with their seeds in them, the greater likelihood that you'll get flower initiation. If those fruits stay on, even if you thin them off at 20 millimeters or hand thin early, the damage from the GA coming from those extra seeds is really difficult to overcome for return bloom. Therefore, blossom thinning becomes a critical tool in managing biennial bearing with alternate bearing varieties like Honeycrisp and Fuji. For blossom thinning in 2026, we have the two caustic products, ATS or lime sulfur and oil, and the two hormone products, NAA or NAD, which work very similarly. I have listed here, and I'm not going to go through them for time, but any of you want to look at this presentation later because it will be posted, can study them. But I want to specifically mention that the lime sulfur rate is 2.5%, 2.5 gallons for every 100 gallons of water. It doesn't matter how much water, well, it kind of matters how much water you're putting on per acre, because too little, you don't get the product on the pistils. But we don't try to concentrate this using a concentration factor. We add 2% oil, 2 gallons of oil for every 100 gallons of water. And that will consistently thin. Now, I want to also point out that over the last 15 years, I've said that because ATS is kind of a poor thinning compound at bloom, I was spraying earlier than the recommended timing on the pollen tube growth model. We were timing these blossom sprays at 60% of the pollen tube growth model data. However, with lime sulfur and oil, I'm suggesting we time it at the 80% level of the pollen tube growth model. Now, I'll comment briefly about the two hormone sprays. They've tended to work and they've tended not to work, depending on the year. They're relatively safe. You don't have to time them as exactly as the caustic ones with the pollen tube growth model. They can improve return bloom on Honeycrisp. But in 2025, we had a number of cases where people sprayed NA during bloom and it killed some seeds, but the fruits then didn't ever fall off. And so we had relatively small, low seed count fruits. And that can be a problem when the conditions following the application of NA are not such that it puts stress on the tree and the fruit fall off. So just keep that in mind as you decide whether or not you're going to spray a caustic spray or hormone type spray. I've put this slide up a couple of years now, and what my thought is that when we have decent weather conditions, meaning no frost, well, that's kind of blown out of the water this year, but also it's not too hot and bloom is not too fast. There's some years when it's really warm and we go from first open bloom to full bloom in about 24 hours. It's pretty hard to get on two caustic sprays when blossom period is that fast. So on the years when it's not that fast, when we have several days between the first application of lime sulfur and the second application of lime sulfur, those are the perfect years to use the caustic thinners. The hormone thinners, because they don't need to be timed as precisely as the caustic thinners, they're more useful when you have really fast bloom, temperatures are too hot, or you have conditions where there's some frost or frost forecasted. This is what I'm suggesting you do with the pollen tube growth model. First, you need to measure the pistil length on some flowers of each variety. Sort of an average number is 9 millimeters, but measure it because I am expecting that this year with frost, we'll have different lengths of both the stem on the fruit and the length of the pistil, which is impacted by temperature. And so it's critical this year that you actually measure the length of the pistil using the diagram that's on the right. Then you kind of keep track of the trees, and when you have enough flowers open, let's say your target number is 100 apples, when you have 100 flower clusters on spurs that are open, you start the model, and then you would spray lime sulfur and oil when the model reaches 80%, or if it's ATS, 60%. And you can see in the graph below how the model grows when you start at a certain time, and then when you spray, it resets and starts over again, and you spray a second time, and then it resets. In some cases in Washington, they spray 3 times, but in New York, I don't feel like that's a really important thing. If you can get 2 sprays on timed pretty good with the model, you'll be fine. Now, moving on to my third suggestion is related to petal fall thinning. There's an important point I want to make here is that the fruits are more sensitive to thinners at the petal fall timing when they grow a little bit, when they get as big as 5 to 6 millimeters, which is generally about 3 days after when we would typically say it's petal fall. Over the years that I've measured fruits and done this 17-year study I'll mention in a minute, when fruitlets are right at petal fall, they're about 4 millimeters, but they're not yet growing very fast. But as soon as they have a few days to start to grow, and we can sort of tell when the stem turns up on a downward pointed spur, then they respond much better to the hormone thinners, whereas at 4 millimeters, they don't respond. So wait a couple of days. Perhaps you'll spray your insecticide and fungicide right at petal fall. But time the thinning spray based upon degree days that you'll see in the carbohydrate model of about 110 to 130 degree days is the window when fruits are now 5 millimeters to 6 millimeters and they'll start to respond. Now, the last point about petal fall thinning is we've done a number of trials in the last few years with different products sprayed at petal fall. And it turns out that the most common product that I've recommended over the years is NAN7 for almost all varieties, especially Honeycrisp, but also Gala. But the problem is when I do a trial and show just how much thinning I got from that, in many years I get almost zero. And it's frustrating, but we still recommend a petal fall spray because it might be the only spray that works that year. But in the last several years, starting in 2023, I've compared those traditional NA7s or Maxell 7s with Maxell and Exceed. And Maxell and Exceed has worked relatively well for me at petal fall. Now, this is a chart that I developed from the 17-year study just to make one point. And on the y-axis is, sort of the sensitivity of the tree to thinners. And the day 0 on the x-axis is petal fall when they're 4 millimeters. And you can tell that it's about 0 sensitivity for the blue line, which is delicious, or the orange line, which is Gala. I don't understand why this Macintosh is negative, but it's basically not positive, meaning there's no response to the thinner. But you get out 3 or 4 days and we start to get a decent response of about 1 fruit per every gram of carbohydrate. And of course, the maximum response to thinners is out about 14 days after petal fall. That's the 10 to 12, 11 millimeters. But this point early on at petal fall is important because you can get some decent thinning if you wait just a few days. Now, this is some data showing how well Exceed and Maxell worked with two varieties, Gala or Snapdragon. The chart on the left shows that the unthinned control, there was tremendous fruit set on Gala, had 650 apples on the unthinned trees. Where I sprayed ACC alone, absolutely no thinning. Where I sprayed ACC and NA, absolutely no thinning. But the blue bar that I've highlighted shows ACC and Maxell was the only treatment at petal fall that gave me some thinning and reduced it to around 500 fruits. It's still too many, but it gets you started. If I put ACC and 7 in the next to the last column, no thinning. But NA and Carbryl, my standard that we've recommended over the years is the best thing for petal fall, also gave absolutely no thinning in that year in 2023. This past year with Snapdragon, we had a little bit better response from some of the other products, the unthinned control. We had about a crop load of 30 with NA and 7. We dropped it down to about 24 with Maxell and 7. We dropped it to about 19, ACC and NA about 19. But again, ACC and Maxell at petal fall dropped crop load to 16. Now our target is a horizontal line, which is about 7 fruits per square centimeter. So we still had quite a bit of ways to go. But this good result from petal fall with these two products has been fairly encouraging. Now, I acknowledge that Exceed is an expensive product, but I want to mention one interesting little thing we've learned about it. You know that it's a product that produces ethylene, but that ethylene is generated inside the leaf. Now, a recent study showed that very little of the Exceed you spray is absorbed by the leaf. Therefore, we've got to get more into the leaf, and so the use of a surfactant is essential. I don't know which is the best. They're suggesting Regulate. I'm testing that against several others this year, but you've got to use a surfactant with it. But this ethylene that's produced right around petal fall is interesting because Pollyanna, when she was here, did some work which showed that a naturally thinning variety like Sweet Tango or another naturally thinning variety like Evercrisp, they produce ethylene naturally at bloom and sometimes as late as petal fall. And that's why some fruits fall off. So this ethylene, just as fruits are starting to set, is helpful to get some fruits to fall off. And is one of the reasons why I'm kind of enthused about this particular approach. Now, I'm going to move forward from petal fall to my fourth suggestion, and that is the normal spray on which we depend most years to get most of our thinning done really is dependent on the tree's carbohydrate status. Therefore, the carbohydrate model becomes a critical tool in deciding when to spray and how much to spray. Now, I show here on the bottom the chart from the carbohydrate model showing in 2023, the 10 millimeter spray was connected with an extreme carbohydrate deficit. Now, I cut off the x-axis somehow, but it's around -40. And we got really great thinning from a 10 millimeter spray in 2023. In contrast, in 2025, at the 10 millimeter timing, we had a surplus, and we got almost no thinning from the same chemicals. Therefore, looking at the carbohydrate model before you put on the 10 to 12 millimeter is extremely valuable. Now, I've put here a list of the guidelines that I built into the model, just so you'll see what the rules are. Because when you log into the carbohydrate model and select your weather station and your bloom date and your green tip date, it will calculate for every day, the carbohydrate balance, and it will give you one of these little recommended statements. Now, in the rules, whenever carbohydrate balance is positive, we have a surplus, and it's greater than +10, I think you've got to increase your rate of chemical by 30% and add Regulate. Now, if the carbohydrate balance is only slightly positive between 0 and 10, then I think you increase rate a little less, but you still add Regulate. But once the carbohydrate balance is negative, between 0 and 20 is optimum. That's where we wish we could be every year. We get good thinning, and you just apply the full standard rate. But as the carbohydrate balance gets more negative on the day you spray and the projected next 5 days, then you start to consider reducing rate 15% or 30%. But the main point to prevent overthinning is the last statement. Whenever this carbohydrate balance is more negative than minus 50 grams on a 6-day average or 5-day average, I think you shouldn't ever spray. You should just wait, get better carbohydrate balance, less negative, because when you put that chemical thinner on top of that natural negative carbohydrate balance, you often get overthinning. Remember what I've said the last couple of years, that kind of deficit is almost the same thing as a strong chemical spray. It gives natural thinning just because the fruits are shorted with carbohydrate they need to keep growing. Now, my fifth suggestion is after that spray, or even before that spray, to know what the petal fall spray did, you've got to figure out what happened. And the best way to do that is the fruit growth rate model. Measure with a caliper the diameters of all these fruits. That takes a fair amount of time, and people get frustrated with it, but it gives extremely accurate assessments of how much thinning. And so I push people to measure. And we have tried to give some guidance that when you put on a spray and you look at the carbohydrate model the next few days, it will tell you when about 50-degree days have passed since you put that spray on. That's when you do your first measurement. And when about 120 more or degree days have passed since that application, you make your second measurement. Now you can download the best version of the fruit growth rate model from the App Store, either Mac or Android. It's called the MaluSim app. You can run this off your phone. You can run it off your computer. If you want to do it on your computer, you go to malusim.org, I think. If you do this and you have trouble, you can send me the data and I'll interpret it and help you. Now, a different approach, it's maybe in some ways simpler, is the Todd Einhorn modification of the fruit growth rate model, where instead of measuring diameters, you just go collect 200 fruits and weigh them individually on a small scale. And he has just published the how-to article in the Fruit Quarterly. It came out in my desk about 10 days ago. Hopefully you've all gotten it. But there is specific instruction on how to do this if you want to buy a small scale that connects directly to your computer and then weigh the individual 200 fruits. It will also predict how much thinning you got. One small highlight is the point number 3. If you just pick fruits that exist on whatever spurs, you might miss spurs that don't have any more fruits. They all fell off, and that biases your result. So what we suggest is you tag a bunch of spurs before, at pink or full bloom, and then select fruits from a certain number of spurs each time. Suggestion number 6, and I'm getting close to finishing, Craig and Mario. Whenever we don't get the amount of thinning we need in the bloom, petal fall, and 12 millimeter sprays, we still have an option to spray at 16 to 18 millimeters. Some people like to say the range is 16 to 20 millimeters, but I almost never get good thinning at 20 millimeters. So I narrow the range to 16 to 18 millimeters. Over the years, we've tried a lot of products, and aggressive and Maxell and 7 and oil has been the best until we were able to get results from the 2 new thinners, Exceed or Brevis. Now, Brevis is not registered in New York, whereas this year, because apparently it's going to be in August. All the other states have it. And when we have Brevis, it will also be a very potent thinning product at this timing. But at the moment, the best success we've had is combining Maxell and Exceed. For some reason, the Maxell and the surfactants that it has have worked much better than anything else we've ever tried. So my specific suggestion is if you get in a position where you need more thinning and you're already out 16 millimeters, spray 400 parts per million of Exceed, 100 parts per million of Maxell, and a pint of Regulade, and do it before the biggest fruits get to be 18 millimeters. However, I will give you this caution. If the carbohydrate balance is negative, you'll get some decent thinning and you'll be very happy. But when the carbohydrate balance is positive, like it was in 2025, then we get poor thinning response. And nothing we've done has worked well at 16 to 18 millimeters, not even Brevis, which we'll talk about more next year. My last suggestion is don't forget the return bloom sprays. We've seen this all many times before, but we start the first one around 16, 17 millimeters. So there's a few additional tips I mention every year. I'd like you to time your sprays based on degree days that you can see on the carbohydrate model when you log into it over NUA or in the MaluSim app. I'd like you to consider nozzling your sprayer differently. So the bloom sprays, uniform drop distribution up and down the bank. But when you get to the later sprays, only spray the top of the tree, especially that 16 to 18 millimeters. And then lastly, to reinforce, if you have a carbohydrate surplus, when you want to spray, include Regulate in your mix. If, however, you have a carbohydrate deficit when you're going to spray, don't include Regulate because it will give you too much thinning. So with that, I'll stop and thank you for your attention. And hopefully as you get a sense of what really happened with the frost, maybe you'll get your courage up to do some aggressive thinning. Thank you.
Thanks. We're a little short on time, so if people have questions for Terence, please put them in the chat box, and I'm sure Terence can answer them there, right? Mario, I'll let you introduce our next speaker. Or I will introduce Dr. Jason
It's
Londo.
me.
Thanks, Jason. Screen is yours.
Okay, let me see. Grab it here. Let's just make sure that this works because I got multiple screens. You seen what you're supposed to see? Or
Yep.
do you need...
Looks good.
All right, so I didn't have a long presentation planned for this. Basically, I mostly do question and answer to the best of my ability, but I thought I'd share with you a little bit of what I can talk about in the last 2 nights of freezing. And so what I want to introduce here is this is my homemade sensor tower I have out at my experimental block here in Geneva. And it's just a trellis post with a 2x2 strapped to the top with a bunch of sensors for temperature, humidity. And the point of putting 9 sensors in one location is just to catch how different the temperatures are across the surface of the orchard. And this is an example. So the sensors are every 20 inches going from 2 inches off the ground to 162 inches in the air. So just about 14 feet. This is the weather profile that we had for the last 2 nights of freeze. And so here, the darker purple color is 2 inches off the ground, and it ramps up to the to the bright green color at 162 inches. And so 2 nights ago, we had a light freeze, which is shown here in this shaded box. And what I wanted to illustrate is you see how the purple is colder than all the green. So that's telling you that the ground temperature is colder than the sensors that are up more in the canopy. Then we go through the rest of the day, and you see we go up above freezing. But then last night when we went and we had the much harder freeze here on campus, you can see that we reached down here a low somewhere around 23, 24 degrees Fahrenheit. But there's a huge amount of variation between the soil level and above the canopy, as you can see here by the spread of these temperature lines. And so what you're seeing here is an inversion, and the conditions that occurred last night were much more conducive to inversion forming, where the colder air sinks to the ground and you have a warm air buffer above the canopy. And these are the conditions where a frost fan can sometimes be helpful by mixing up these different temperature gradients and making the ground temperature actually raise relative to the rest of the tree. And so last night we had an inversion here in Geneva. Whether or not you received inversions wherever you're growing is going to depend on your local conditions. You basically need to have low to no wind and clear skies for a strong inversion to form. And so we had evidence of that showing here. This is just a zoom in on the 2 freeze events, just so you can see that the inversion was a lot stronger in the second freeze. And for much of the time, so here plotted in the dotted red line here, is 28 degrees Fahrenheit, which is sort of the start point for some of the damage we would expect to see on full bloom flowers. And so we were well below that. Luckily here in Geneva, our phenology, we were just mostly at tight cluster in my blocks, but we're still quite a bit colder than we wanted to see. This is just another version of that showing you relative to the soil temperature. So here you can see how much warmer, how much warmer the top of the canopy was relative to the soil. So soil here would be at 0, and we were almost up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer at the about a meter above the canopy. So there was a good inversion here. And then just another version of showing you what the temperature duration looked like throughout these last 2 days. Again, each sensor here is a different block, and you can see that we get these flips between the cold points, whether it's near the soil or up above the canopy. Again, I'm just sort of beating this one to death. The types of freezes that we experience impact how the frosts are, how they convey damage to the trees, and radiative freezing like we had last night, where we have an inversion. Typically the tissue temperatures are colder than the air temperatures that we record. And that's due to some interesting physics in that when you have clear skies and no wind, heat loss from the plant tissue is directly to space. There's nothing to slow it down. And so as that tissue is cooling, it cools the air and it builds the inversion. And so while last night here in Geneva, we saw 23 degrees near the soil, plant tissues near the soil were probably even colder than that. The sensors don't do radiative cooling in the same way. And so you should infer that the temperatures during radiative cooling that the plant experiences can actually be lower than what your weather station reads. I know that sounds doom and gloomy. It's just more about understanding the difference between an advective freeze when a cold front moves through and there's a lot of cold wind. In those cases, weather stations and your plant tissues are about the same temperature. During radiative conditions, the plant tissues are colder than your weather stations. I know this is a lot to take in a really rapid fire way, so I'm happy to send out the figures to anybody who wants to look at this more closely. I also wanted to just show you the most up-to-date phenology versus freeze risk information that we have. This is out of Michigan State, and I've put in the red box here, sort of where we assume that damage is starting. And you can see here for apples and pears at around 27, 28 degrees Fahrenheit, which we definitely received here in Geneva. You can start damaging tight cluster and anything more phenologically developed. In pears, you can see that tight cluster and the early first white are a little bit more hardy than the other stages. But again, we're still working in that same operational zone. If we look at the cherries, again, same numbers, 26, 27, 28 is sort of the cutoff when you start seeing some damage. And then depending on how cold each location is, you can get up to total damage. And here's apricots, peaches, and plums. It's same temperature range. Part of this is because plant tissues, as they get more and more developed, have more and more water, and there's simply a limited ability for the plant to survive freezing events as soon as their tissues are filled with water. So while there's a little bit of variation in the temperature here between the different crops, once you get to this level of development, anything below 27, 26 is pretty much going to give you some damage. That's going to depend very much, of course, on the local topography in your orchards. And as I've already shown you with the temperature ramp, during a radiative frost, the temperatures are colder near the ground. So flower clusters that are near the ground are going to take more damage than flower clusters that are near the top of the tree. And just as a last little showcase, so I collected just one. This is not a good statistical representation. I went out to my block. I have some Aztec Fuji that was just starting to turn pink on the king bloom. I picked a cluster. I brought it back. I cut all of the flower buds longitudinally, and all the laterals were green, as you can see on the side here, green, no evidence of damage. And the king showed this blackened pistil base. And so one thing that you can do if you have concerns about the temperatures in your location and the phenology, go out and collect some flower clusters. If this happened since I collected this morning, you could do this tomorrow, and I'm sure you'll have enough damage. Just take a razor blade, cut it longitudinally, look inside. If you see that the pistil is brown and black, the pistil is what's important for setting your fruit and giving you seeds. And so if you're showing a lot of damage, you should count on those flowers as not being productive. In this case, like I said, all the laterals on the one cluster I picked were green. The king was showing damage. And then the end of this thing was mitigation. And this is where I wish I had more to share with you. We really don't have any silver bullets for mitigating frost and freeze risk. This current event happened because we had a week we had the warmest March on record, and then we had a week of temperatures in the 80s. And there's just really nothing that can stop a plant from growing under those conditions. We had a plenty long winter, plenty of chilling. So the plants are primed for growing, and they did what they were supposed to do. As for what growers can do, the best mechanical method is overhead sprinklers. And the idea here is you mist water on top of the exposed flowers and leaves. That water freezes. As it freezes, it creates an insulation layer and also releases heat as it's freezing. And this can protect your tissues. The issue we have is that the infrastructure is expensive. And I didn't finish that thought. It's challenging to manage is what the end of that thought was supposed to be. Frost fans can be used if you have a temperature inversion. That is typically only effective during radiative frosts, and those are also quite expensive to run. I did want to share that we do have several trials ongoing. Terence's program and my program participate in this SCRI project, the SPARK project, where we're evaluating frost and freeze preventatives. So we do have trials ongoing. They fall into basically two types of categories: hormonal control of phenology. And this is basically spraying the plant with different hormones, trying to convince it to stay asleep. And so we would dodge a frost through that hormonal control. And then there's an insulation approach, where basically you spray a product onto the sensitive tissues, try to create a freeze barrier and slow the rate of chilling that goes on in those tissues so that you can dodge the frost. And so in both these cases, there are a lot of products on the market that are touted as being very effective. And I think to date, we haven't found much support for these products being highly efficient. And so we're still working on those for you. And that's all I have for you. I know that was quick, but we've got a tight window. So if someone's got questions, I'm happy to answer now, or I have to bug out at 2 to go pick up my kiddo at kindergarten, but I can always follow up with emails.
Any questions for Jason? We have a couple minutes. Either you can unmute yourself or in the chat box. Your graphics are really cool, Jason. We're all in awe.
It's one of the good applications of using artificial intelligence is that it can help you write data management pathways to rip out figures in a couple of minutes. So
nice. Got a question here. Have you tried Matthew Whiting's WSU sprayable anti-crystallization material? Crystallation.
Yes, I believe, and Terence, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's the product that we're testing or one of the products that we're testing in the SPARK project.
You're muted, Terence.
You're muted.
Yes, that's correct. We tested it last year, but didn't have the natural frost. But in the lab, didn't seem to give us much.
Yeah, and I would say reports from the other project participants that are testing it have seen mixed results. Sometimes it looks like maybe there's a little protection, but it's still not worked out.
Another question here. Would you expect to see brown pistils in most kings or only on the lower part of the tree?
Oof, that's going to be location dependent. So the kings are going to be the most sensitive because they're the most phenologically advanced. I would say if you were right there on the damaged line and you had an inversion like I recorded, then yes, you would have more damage lower than up high. The best way to do this would be to sample a couple positions on the tree. And of course, don't do one cluster. I just grabbed one because I didn't have much time to pull this together. But if you're concerned about this, sample several trees across a broader area so that you don't happen to grab just a frost pocket. But it's easy enough with a razor blade just to do a quick slice and look. You'll be able to see with your naked eye.
How soon would we expect to see damaged tissue and buds? Would you see the damage today?
So I collected that flower cluster this morning at 8 a.m. and I put it on my desk here in my office and I cut it while Terence was talking. And so basically 4 or 5 hours of room temperature is enough for you to see it. So if you wanted to wait until tomorrow, just let nature take its course. It'll warm up a bit today. They'll brown faster if you move them to room temperature. The thing I would like to point out is that one that I actually cut is the petals were not oxidizing, the stamens were not oxidizing. So in all likelihood, that flower would continue to open and look like a normal flower, but the pistils themselves were nuked. So don't rely on flower presence as an indication of freeze damage. If you're in a spot that got cold enough that you're concerned, cut some buds and it'll give you a much better metric for you to evaluate whether or not you're going to have some problems downstream.
Great. We got one more minute. Anybody have another question?
I've got a question. Jason, I've already fielded this question from a grower and I've already given them my answer. So we've gotten a frost and we couldn't do anything about it. Post-mortem, there's some discussion about either promelin or some kelp extract products. First one being something that kind of strengthens the cells and is purported to give some level of protection. Second one, I think, has a certain there to it. I don't know if anybody wants to speak in terms of what someone should be doing in the coming days ahead.
Yeah, so with I'll couch this in, I've only worked in apples a couple of years, and so I should not be taken as the ultimate authority, but I believe promelin can work if you already have fruitlets initiated, because you're basically tricking the tree into thinking it has seeds, so the fruit continues to develop. For example, if you take the flower cluster I just showed you, if you spray that up with promelin, I don't think anything would happen because the pistil is what's going to eventually become your fruit, and that's gone. And so I don't think anything at this point, I don't think spraying anything on trees like in the status I looked at will change the outcome. There's no way to sort of resuscitate that pistil. It's the weakest part of the flower, and once it goes, it goes. There's just no backup. Whereas we could, if the pistil was a little stronger and the petals and the stamens were the weak point, you would still have the opportunity to sort of like set fruit and such. But it's my opinion that no, none of those sprays are going to matter at this point. If we had fruitlets and we were weak into that, promelin could be one way of sort of trying to get a little bit of fruit set, but even then you get ugly shaped fruit from those situations.
Thanks. That's the answer I wanted everyone to hear.
Awesome. I think we're good. Thanks, Jason. Appreciate it. And I'll let Mike introduce the next speaker.
Yep, and I would say too, I know obviously the frost is on everyone's mind, so I know Jason has to bump out at 2, but you can probably keep chatting with him in the chat box till he has to take off. But we will go ahead and introduce our next speaker. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Kerik Cox of Cornell AgriTech, who's going to be discussing disease management through pink and bloom time. So Kerik, the screen is yours.
All right, thank you. Let me do some sharing. Sort of give you my. Let's move some stuff around. Good. We can take a look at all our updates and see what the state of things are in New York today. Well, just scratch the surface of fire blight, mostly focusing on apple scab because it's pretty cold still. Fire blight's time, but it's not quite there yet. Not too much different than what I talk about on scaffold. It's been a pretty cold winter from about early to mid-March. Many cold days, and then as Jason mentioned, we get many hot days with a lot of extended hot weather with sort of freezing dips. Case in point, very recently, and looks like kind of a strange year because we really hit green tip almost in the same time for both Long Island, Hudson Valley, Capital District, and the Finger Lakes in Western New York were sort of hit quickly by this burst of hot weather and pushed everybody to almost onto the same schedule, depending on what variety and how early it was. And then, of course, Lake Champlain area was much further on green tip and maturity. And it's very strange to sometimes seeing sites in Geneva and the Finger Lakes exceeding the maturity of the apple scab in the Hudson Valley, but I think this just depends on the type of weather and heat that we've gotten that was fairly extended, if you will. I mean, we had snow cover, which was good, and then we had a recent bout of heavy rains from tight cluster to pink, depending on where you were. Most noticeable in the Western New York area. So it's been kind of a strange scenario for making, statewide recommendations for applying for apple scab, but we do it on a location-specific basis. Most of the major infection events, there was one right at the beginning of that green tip period from about March 31st to about April 4th, less than 10% ejection. And it's one of those events that if you had done your coverage with your copper silver tip or copper green tip, you're doing great. And then for those who experience the extremely extended rainfall from about 414 to 419, it's a big one, 15 to 20% ejection, followed by some rather cold weather. It's a pretty cold, easy week. Not too bad thus far. Lots of rain, but it's cool, sometimes warm, but never too warm for apple scab. There were a couple events that could have snuck through because they were right on the border of being too cold during the rain, and sometimes not too many too hot, but approaching it. And where we are now, if you're following scaffolds and all the other resources, I'm trying to discourage you from using the single site fungicides just yet and trying to convince everyone to focus on a lot of copper early on to knock down both fire blight and apple scab inoculum, and to focus on your Cap 10 mancozeb if you can as we're moving through pink. But if you need something with punch or kickback, I'm recommending the Dodine. And if you're in one of those really awful 5-day apple scab infection period windows, I've recommended putting it on right after the event to give yourself a little bit of reach back. You're not necessarily letting the orchards develop a lot of inoculum that's going uncontrolled. You're putting stuff on to protect the crop, and now you're just grabbing a little bit backwards and protecting forward. The other option at this point is the Scala Vanguard, and we'll talk about this on the other page. We had this big 15% ejection. You could have done it beforehand, but you were probably fine with a nice protectant Cap 10 mixed with mancozeb, because we didn't really know it was going to be this bad. But if you put this on ahead of time, it's even better. And if you use Dodine ahead, I'd recommend Scala Vanguard now. These work really well on apple scab, but not the other diseases. And the other diseases aren't ready to cause trouble just yet in our apple orchards. This is all scab. The particularly nice thing about Scala Vanguard is they work really well in cold weather, which is what we're having now. So if you don't want to do post-infection with Dodine, put one of these on. I might be hesitant to use Full Inspire Super over Scala or Vanguard because then you lose one of your group 3s. And then for the rest of the week, we got nothing. You could just, if you're not worried about a large post-infection event, you could just go forward and do your Cap 10 80 at 2.5 with your mancozeb at 3. Or for the rest of this week, you could probably get away with a biopesticide. I'm not even spraying. I sprayed during the infection event when I got dry weather last Friday for my own research, and now I'm just going to wait for the next thing to happen. In terms of fire blight, where are we right now? Late March, April, hot. And we could have seen oozing and pushing cankers in fields. I'm surprised I didn't get any pictures of any, but that's great. We'll take it. It might be that these cold spikes keep the apple trees from making their delicious fire blight maple syrup, if you will. A lot of rain, very scary. But right now, only I would imagine orchards in eastern New York and Long Island are in bloom. And they just skipped a very scary period, but now they're going into a cold season. Last year was a little different. I'll talk about what the situation was like in 2020, 24, 25. Kind of a cold bloom period with cool, wet petal fall made it a pretty easy fire blight season. I can generally judge on how bad the fire blight season is depending on how many samples I get in the fire blight survey, like about 3. And some of those came at the end of the summer. So in that case, it was a pretty easy fire blight season. We're looking at an initial cold bloom period, but it's just hard to predict the petal fall. This is the kind of trend from last year. Long Island had a pretty easy going time the entire bloom season. Yep, about 413 So when it hit, and about 5:11 when it was over, and they never hit extreme. Hopefully everyone on Long Island dodged it with very little effort. This is something you just knock out by, spraying toothpaste and biopesticides. Probably didn't need strep, but if you used it, you're safe. Hudson Valley had some more challenging, just a hair predicted bloom behind that, starting off with some pretty hot weather, but avoiding the nasty petal fall spike. I feel like when we get a lot of extreme hot, wet weather at petal fall during the thinning period, the chances of injury and fire blight getting out of control is the greatest. In that case, Capital District did sort of have that situation, but for the most part, they probably this nice spike of cold weather about mid-bloom kind of really shut that down. And same thing with the Finger Lakes. I had plenty of fire blight in my blocks, but I'm dumping inoculum on them. But in terms of overall devastation, it wasn't that bad. It was pretty good. And then what else do we have? Lake Champlain. They had a little more challenging. See, really cold bloom, really hot petal fall. Hopefully no one had any trouble. I think one or two people maybe in that region had some trouble, but not too much. And it's all right. And then Western New York, New Orleans, easy. Had something right at the beginning. You kind of want to watch these, and we'll talk a little bit about that for 2026. But for the rest of it, it was just a walk in the park, and that's probably why we didn't get a lot of samples. Niagara, the same. Super easy fire blight season. What can we really say? Basically, Eastern New York and Long Island are fairly similar. Potentially had bloom right at the start, some higher risk weather. And other than that, with rain, so this could be a trouble. If you see fire blight, don't hesitate. Send us something or send me an email and I'll get you something as well. It was a pretty nasty period if you had flowering crop. Going into the end of last week, pretty easy, and then it ramped up very quickly on both fire blight risk models, and we had rain. But fortunately, hopefully everyone got a strep on if you had open flowers or something, or had enough copper in the early part of the season to knock the inoculum down so much that it really wouldn't give you much trouble. So it's going to be cool over the week and into the weekend. Approaching the pink period. We don't want this nasty thing here, the blossom blight. I don't think you need to really push hard for bloom. Nothing with a really intense application, particularly if you already put something on last week in Eastern New York and Long Island. I don't know, you could use some Blossom Protect. We're so far away from petal fall. You could do pretty well with that. And I am going to mention Bloom Time Live. Works really great. It's not registered yet, but I want to put it on everybody's radar as another excellent competitive inhibition type product. And I've talked about that at the winter meeting. If you are looking into doing some pink PGRs, SARs, make sure to do it on at least a warmer, sunnier day. The colder it is, the trees really won't respond to the PGRs that much, or they'll be sort of physiologically, and I'll put these on. You can either do the 6 ounces per 100, or a lot of us are having great success across the entire country with the 2 ounces of ProHex plus the 1 ounce of Actigard, particularly in young trees. It tends to, according to a large analysis I did with many states of data, this works the best in Michigan and New York. Fortunately, we're in Michigan and New York. And I also suspect this would work great in New England as well. It's one of these situations where the little bit of the ProHex and a little bit of the acylbenzolar S-methyl and Actigard gives you double the plant resistance response, or a little more. So in this case, 2 + 1 is equal to 4 instead of 2 + 1 = 3, or 2 + 1 = 6. And so the idea being is that sort of prevents the invasion of the tissues by the bacteria. They just get a little more robust. Their cell walls get a little thicker, and the bacteria's molecular warfare tools can't punch and inject and sort of can't break through the walls that the plant cells have, and then they can't invade and give you the gross, nasty blossom cluster that you see later. That pretty much wraps up my presentation. Take some questions, move on to Scott.
All right, thank you very much, Kerik. We have 1 minute left, so if there is a quick question for Kerik, feel free to type it in the chat box. Otherwise, I'll turn things over to Dan to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Mike. I'd like to welcome Dr. Scott Cosseboom, our plant pathologist at the Cornell Hudson Valley Lab, invite him to our webinar. Scott, share your screen and take it away.
All righty, how's it look?
I
Looks
think
good.
you're
Looks
good.
looks good.
All right, great. Thank you. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, thanks, Kerik, for the good intro to the disease situation and considerations. So, I'll just touch base a little bit off of, some of my what I'm seeing, and then get into a little bit more about more later season considerations as well. Um, so yeah, Kerik gave a great overview of, what the whole state is looking like. I've been paying a lot of attention to the Hudson Valley. I think for the most part, from the infection events that I've seen per scab that we've been through the last few weeks, they have not been too intense. So, a typical control program of early season copper and mancozeb should have done a great job of protecting the crop. But I did want to highlight just that there is we do have a lot of ascospore maturity. So I highlighted it in yellow here. At the end of this week, a lot of our spores will be matured, but we haven't ejected that many. So, looking ahead, if we do get a large, rain event and like the rest of this season, or the rest of this week looks really smooth sailing. We do have like those lower temperatures, not as much rain, but I do see some rain on the extended forecast. And so, yeah, just keep in mind that if we do get those more intensive rains and if things warm up a bit, that's when we're going to see scab infection risk. But at least for now, I think so far it hasn't been too terrible of a season. I've just heard that it's been hard to find a good window to get some sprays on. But besides that, I think in terms of scab pressure, it's not too crazy. We do have cedar apple rust galls that I've seen are active in those really extended wet conditions. Those galls are out there spreading their spores around. And so if cedar apple rust is a concern, make sure that you're covered for both scab and rust. Shortly after bloom, blister spot is a concern. And so if you have susceptible varieties, then just be, cognizant of the window for controlling blister spot. Some trials that I've done in the last 2 seasons found that Cosseboom is really effective for controlling blister spot, so that could be a good option there. And then for summer rots and like late season rots, I would probably focus mostly on bitter rot control. And that if you're focusing on that, it should keep the rest of the orchard clean. And using Captan as really like the foundation of the control for bitter rot and the other rots, but saving some of the site specifics for really heavy infection events. And so the rest of my time, I wanted to just dive a little deeper into bitter rot because I know this is more of a later season disease, but I mean, the Hudson Valley, we're basically in full bloom now. We'll be at petal fall maybe at the end of next week. So things are moving quickly. And bitter rot will be upon us soon. So the kind of key window for bitter rot is, from the research that I've read, shows that 20 days after petal fall is when the fruits start becoming susceptible. And then from there until harvest is kind of a really long window of where we can get infections from Calototricum that cause this disease. So it's a pretty broad window, and those conditions can be kind of variable throughout the season. We don't currently have a bitter rot model available on NUA. There is a sooty blotch and fly speck model that's available, but nothing that's specifically for bitter rot. And so what I did last season, and what I'm going to do again this year is to evaluate a few different models, and then I also have some money to get like a preliminary version of one of these models put up on NUA for to be, more broadly accessible to you all. So these are 4 different models that are available or that were published, but they haven't really been validated for bitter rot. And last season, we had these 6 different treatments where we were spraying based off of these model predictions from those 4 different models. We also had like a non-treated control and like a kind of a standard 14-day plus or minus treatment interval, depending on how much rain we were getting. So kind of using like a general like rule of thumb, but like with these more hard rules here. But this is just an example of what the output was looking like. And most of the models tended to agree, on really highly conducive weather conditions. Most of the models would agree when there was an infection event. And so if we saw this in the forecast, we would spray our trees for each of these different treatments ahead of the infection event. And there's a lot of data here, and I didn't want to get too much into the weeds, but when we sprayed according to the models, all the models worked equally well, and they worked just as well as kind of that standard, trying to space the sprays out about 14 days or tightening up the interval if there was a lot of rain. And we did this in Virginia, New Jersey, and New York on 2 different varieties in each state. So we have a couple trials there, but it was only 1 season of data. And so we're going to repeat this again, like I said. But the initial results are looking pretty favorable. This table shows the number of treatments we were spraying Captan for each of the treatments. And it showed that when we applied, if we were using these models to time the applications, we were able to reduce the number of sprays per season. The Crucius model was a little bit more sensitive, so it would predict infection more frequently than the others. And so that's something to take into consideration. So we're trying to figure out which of these models is going to be the most suitable. But I think in general, right now, they do give a good kind of idea of what certain weather conditions are doing with this pathogen. And so I did want to make this available to you. And so I have this website called bitterrotmodel.com. It's a temporary website that will show these model predictions, and it's live. It's updated every day, every morning. But it will be moved over to NUA hopefully soon. And so that's something that you could look at to get kind of a reference for what conditions are conducive for this disease, but I would not rely on it. It's very preliminary. And then the locations that we have in that website are just the locations for the experiments that we're doing. So the Hudson Valley lab here, a research farm in New Jersey, and a research farm in Virginia. So, but just wanted to throw that out there that it might be helpful. And yeah, hopefully we'll have that available on NUA soon. And we're gonna narrow down a really good model there. And that's pretty much it. I have a couple other projects I'm working on, but I just wanted to mostly highlight the bitter rot. I know that's a really big concern for a lot of people. And Kerik did a great job of covering the scab and fire blight, and definitely keep a lookout for the e-alerts and for the Scaffolds podcast where day-to-day or weekly updates are included. So
Well, thank you very much, Scott. We are at our time limit, but we have one quick question. And Glenn Kohler was inquiring about what varieties other than Mutsu Crispin are susceptible to blister spot. Mike Baisdow had responded that he'd seen it in Ambrosia in 2024. What would you like to add to that?
Snapdragon is the kind of the big variety that we've been getting a lot of reports about. And then some sampling that Dan and I did in 2024. We looked throughout the Eastern New York, growing region, and it's really the disease was mostly consolidated to the Hudson Valley. So it seems to be like a hot spot that we have here. But Snapdragon is a big one. We also have potential report on Sweet Tango.
Thank you, Scott.
Yep.
Next, we're going to switch to the insect world. I'd like to welcome Dr. Monique Rivera to our webinar. Monique is our statewide entomologist based at Cornell AgriTech in Geneva, New York. And Monique, take it away and share your screen.
Okay. So let's get started. We're just going to do a quick overview to remind you of what you should be considering at this point in time, although we're a little strange spring so far. So we're going to go over San Jose scale, oblique banded leaf roller, rosy apple aphid, tarnished plant bug, plum curculio, some suggestions about mating disruption that's currently available and installing timing, and woolly apple aphid, of course, which we are continually being concerned about year over year. I do want to say that in the next hour, the next scaffold should be up, and I go into depth with Jason about the freeze that we just had. This was recorded last Friday, so I'm excited for you guys to hear that. It was a fun conversation. So San Jose scale, generally speaking, at about 1/2 inch green. We're a little bit past that. This is the timing for when you start the initial process of trying to disrupt their establishment in the orchard for the season. So there's really 3 key points for this. So first is the dormant stage, and that is the time when we really can't access them because they're underneath the scale. So when they hit this immature crawler stage, this is when they're at their most exposed, and that's what's pictured in the top right-hand corner, those little yellow guys. And so that's the ideal timing to catch them with treatments. So in the season and during these times when they actually go through the adult flight and development, this is when they start to reestablish. So we're really trying to break that cycle of their population during the year. And so can be very rapid. And when these guys build up on the trees, I think it's even more common in peaches and other, stone fruit to see just crazy infestations if they're not properly managed. And part of this is because they can so rapidly build up the populations, with each female laying between 200 and 400 basically successful young from eggs. So how do we monitor for these guys? I know many people don't do this, but if you have an infestation, I would highly suggest doing this just to best time your applications to prevent further establishment. And so our goal here is to detect that first emergence of the crawlers, as I mentioned. So you can scout for areas, but typically what we're recommending is using the black electrical tape. I would find an established population and put the tape out next to it because they're going to crawl away from the hardened scales. So there's also a sex pheromone trap for these guys, which can be hung around now. We're a little bit behind the 8 ball at Pink, but if you're interested in it, you can hang it now. So for the monitoring tape, you basically just put this tape up and then you can use a 10x hand lens to try to find these little yellow crawlers. So let's get into treatment options. So if you were earlier in the season, you could have tried with a 2% dormant oil spray, on the black cap. So even those cap stages are there and they're sessile, you can still suffocate them with an oil. With this, you could have also used a steam, which I think is a really great option at 1/2 inch green. And this is an insect growth regulator. So the goal here is to get total coverage of the esteem on the woody material or the dormant spray as well. The oil, you want to saturate the woody material. And that's the main goal there. So the soft insecticides that are targeting piercing sucking insects like this. So later in the season, you might use a treatment with Movento. This can also help. Savanto is another one that goes a little bit systemic and can also assist with other piercing sucking insects that might have some impact here, but typically we're recommending the well-timed insect growth regulators, so a steam or centaur. Steam at 1/2 inch green is great because if you have a year-over-year consistent population of woolly apple aphids, this is a great choice at that timing, and we've seen that in our last year's work. There's also some mating disruption and development for San Jose scale. I just wanted to talk about and update on that briefly. So because this is a new pheromone and the EPA, their version of regulation is to put a standard regulation on every type of compound. And so it's a lot of investment for the companies and it takes a long time. I'm pretty sure it's Trace that's moving forward with putting through this pheromone. And so we're hoping to see this in the next, I would say, 3, 4, 5 years. It is quite a long process, but incoming. And I think in many scenarios, especially for people that are growing or attempting to grow with much softer IPM programs, including organic, this is going to be a great development. So bleak banded leaf roller, this can pop up, although I feel like we had some, this is going to be depending on where you are. So the way to scout for these guys is to examine bud clusters, and you're looking for 3% larval infestation. That's a pretty low number. And for these guys, you can use BT products, which are softer on other insects, which is why they're great this early in the season to not disrupt beneficials. And then rosy apple aphid, I highly doubt we're seeing these yet. We haven't had enough of a warm stint to really develop these populations. But if you're going to scout for these guys and you want to see if you do have them a little bit later, you're going to examine clusters or terminal leaves for the wingless adults, which are just standard aphids. And one infested cluster per 10 indicates that it's time to treat. So the treatment suggestions there is you could have tried to approach this with the overwintering stage also with those dormant oils, but all your piercing, sucking insect products like a Movento, Savanto, or a Sail, there's really plenty of options. And usually you can treat for rosy apple aphid and many other things with a singular product. So tarnished plant bug, these guys are a real pain if you have them. I don't think I've heard some reports of them popping up when we had that really warm period last week. Things are starting to get away for me. I can't even figure out, maybe it was the week before. We had a stint where it was very warm, and these guys will be out and about when that happens, even early in the season when it goes back to cold. So when we're having fruit formation post bloom, these can cause aborted fruit. And you can see damage early on from these guys as well. There can be 2 to 3 generations per year. And like I mentioned, they are active in the early season on warmer days. So if you are planning to monitor for these guys, which is somewhat uncommon, but you can do this with a white sticky panel trap along the border, which you would have had to set at silver tip and putting one trap about every 3 to 5 acres. So when it comes to trying to decide based on those trap captures, you're looking at cumulative trap averages, and there are action thresholds. So if you find 3 of them over 5 traps, this is a conservative action threshold. 5 to 8 per 5 traps is a high population. And so you're going to have to be thinking about doing a treatment post bloom because of the products. So once you get into these larger insects, these guys, stink bugs, even plum curculio, pyrethroids tend to be the main group that works. I will say that I say this a lot, and I think that this is the most important thing year over year. So if you have broadleaf weeds in row middles, that is a driver of basically tarnished plant bug wanting to hang out within the orchard, and they will pretty much consistently come back, and you will fight with them in the early season on these warmer years. So the ideal overall year over year thing to do here is to get rid of the broadleaf weeds in the row middles. Now, the more torturous one in the IPM program, I think, is plum curculio. I think last year was a terrible year, especially in the Hudson Valley. They just had such a prolonged activity period, and I will be interested to see if that happens this year. So far, I think we're off to a slow start, but I would imagine that I think Andreas has already mentioned that they've maybe seen them already in the Hudson Valley. I'll let him follow up on that. But this is what their oviposition damage and feeding damage looks like. So it's very common to see the oviposition scars at harvest and the adult feeding damage, which basically looks, that's the one where they say, oh, it looks kind of like a half moon, like you stuck your fingernail into the fruit skin. But they can also do this very early on as the fruit is actually setting in and create chaos that way. So there's a couple things we assume when we're thinking about plum curculio. So first of all, is that they overwinter outside of apple orchards. This is the most common way. If there is a majorly established population, they also can overwinter inside of apple orchards. And if you have a really big population, which is somewhat less common in New York, but as you go south, you can find them roosting there, so to speak, for longer and overwintering in the orchard, in which case people are choosing to try to use entomopathogenic nematodes. So plum curculio adults can migrate then from the edges of the orchards when it warms up, kind of like it was in this early spring warm up. And this is particularly common during bloom. So we're not quite at bloom yet, but it becomes even more of a sensitive treatment period during bloom. So the assumption is that during bloom, this is when the plum curculio adults have moved into the trees and they are hanging out there. And then once we hit petal fall, this is really the oviposition timing. And the length of that timing really depends on the seasonal temperatures. And effective control for these guys, in a lot of ways, is dependent on the preventative insecticide sprays that you apply at petal fall towards the end of oviposition. So let's give an overview, just as an example, of the use of the plum curculio model, which is one that's on NUA that you can utilize for yourself. So on May 21st in Geneva, we're still at 0 degree days. So there was an initial petal fall spray. June 4th, 165 degree days, first cover. And then at 308 degree days, this is pretty much what we're calling 40% the end of oviposition, 40% oviposition, the end of the immigration into the orchard. So being careful to look out for those degree days. This is the correct timing for that spray, is that you want them to be fully in the orchard when you're doing the treatment of the orchard. And then lastly, a kind of slow build up to 474 degree days on June 18th. And that is the first cover spray, end of the first cover control, and that's the time period you're really trying to predict. So 2 sprays, it was a warm spring, but a cool spring, which I'm kind of predicting that we're going to have this year based on the next 2 weeks of temperatures. It's a coolish. This could mean a potential of 3 sprays. So keep an eye out on this. Think about utilizing the model. If you have someone trapping for you, I think that would be very useful in this variable year-over-year situation. Let's move into mating disruption. So if you have not already, now is really a good time to hang the disruptors before things get really crazy. OFM, thinking about this from half-inch green to tight cluster, codling moth typically is hung around bloom, but we have found in the lab that hanging it earlier And typically, because these products are combined, just going ahead with the OFM timing for CM seems to work better for codling moth. We found reduced trap captures. So if you're going to do a sprayable, the idea here is you could put your first sprayable on now and then return every 6 to 8 weeks throughout the season. So I think this technology is overall becoming easier to use with the development of the tanglers. It's so easy to get those guys up in the trees. It's so much faster than the other products, especially if you're used to applying something like the twin tubes at 400 per acre. There's also products that provide less dispensers per acre. So the CM OFM meso dispensers, which are 32 to 38 per acre, I do think those kind of somehow take longer because they're fiddly to get up in the tree compared to the tanglers, which are deployed at about 300 per acre, and you can just throw them up into the trees. So just as a reminder, these are best for blocks that are 8 acres or larger. So moving into the topic that's been the hot topic for the past couple years, woolly apple aphid. I think one of the things we're trying to aim to do is to prevent the establishment of woolly apple aphid by trying to catch populations both as we're moving into the season around half-inch green and also thinking about it post-harvest. What's going on? What kind of infestation are you having? So once you find them on aerial shoots, what that means is that you're looking at shoots that are away from the main stem of the tree. I really find this to be behind the 8 ball when it comes to treatment for these guys. There is the thought that they do physiological damage to the roots, and that's somewhat of a concern. Right now, we're kind of feeling that those populations, if they do exist on your rootstock, are separate, and we are treating the aerial populations on the scion differently and focusing our treatment program on those. So here we have a picture that I've shown many times, and I'm pretty sure that it also is a video that I can hit play on. And so this is a stem that we brought in. So this is from the early season when they're not really feeding, they're not producing the white mass. There's certain things that you need to be looking for. So as you can see, moving in the center of the screen is an actual woolly apple aphid. This is early in the season, cool temperatures, they're already above ground, and essentially they will begin to feed. This, much like San Jose scale, is the timing for when you want to hit them with a steam before you get this white material. And we've found that this pays off later in the year. So if you have an area where you've had problems, go back, scout that area, look for these guys. They blend in very well with the bark. But if you can find where they've previously damaged or split the bark, which is what this like lumpy surface is here behind them, that is a great place to start by looking, because we found that this tissue is a little bit softer and they like to hang out around it. So moving on, so let's think about this over the course of the entire growing season. So when we're in dormancy, we really want to try to target those overwintering populations that have overwintered above ground. And believe it or not, I know we think, oh, it's been like we had a hard winter. My colleague in Michigan State has told me that up in the upper, I don't really know how upper part of the mitten, they have already found them above ground and brought them inside and can find that they will start moving in the warmer conditions. So Michigan's been a lot colder than us this year. And so I'm just not convinced that the cold is really going to be an eliminating factor. So I think trying to prime the season and time that a steam spray so that you're targeting those guys above ground before they start feeding, I think is ideal. So when we actually hit bloom, this is when we get into major limitations on our insecticide options. That's why it's important to kind of think about that pre-bloom period as an early time to target woolly apple aphid. Once we hit post-bloom, we start to have access to Spirotetramat, which is in both Movento, the brand name, and also there is a generic coming by the name of Ateca, which is a high load. But there is also Senstar, which combines the AI of a steam and the Spirotetramat here. So this is a systemic insecticide, Spirotetramat. And so I only really think you should be applying this post bloom at the recommended timing because this is when the plant itself is doing most of its growing. And that is going to give you the best absorption of a systemic product. So once we hit fruit development, this is where things get tricky and we're still trying to refine our recommendations. We are going to try this year a reactive spray program that's based on scouting and try to develop some sort of language so that we're all speaking the same language when we're talking about infestations. But so the main idea here is try to reduce the overwintering populations to start. And then just remember, once you start to see them on the outside of the tree, you're really behind the 8 ball and you should be trying to hit them harder. But ideally, you find them in the interior of the canopy first and start being reactive to early colonizations rather than waiting for them to build up. This was something that was typical when diazinon was common and available. You could wait for them to build up to a certain extent where you actually see them when you drive down the row and then do the treatment. We can no longer go with that because we don't have products like diazinon anymore to work with. So overall, again, we're trying to target the pre-bloom early infestations. If you're finding them above ground before pink, we're recommending a steam at 1/2 inch green. Please remember to avoid Mustang Max and Brigade in your early season pyrethroids because we have found these to be damaging to the woolly apple aphid natural enemies and can cause flares of them quite early in the season, which makes management later in the season even more difficult. So post-bloom, again, this is the timing when you really want to, if you're going to use Spiritetramate, Movento, and or Senstar, this is an ideal timing until we get a contact version of this product, which allegedly is on the way at some point. I really think that this is the best timing if you're going to spend money on this product. In the late season, I do recommend Safina. I know there has been some lore around about it not working. One of the things with Safina that we saw in research looking at adjuvants is that adjuvants can also reduce the efficacy of the product. You have 2 applications, 2 top rate applications that you can do over the course of the season. I would highly recommend going in with this alone. And again, making sure that your water pH is adjusted and certainly not too basic, but you do not need an adjuvant with this product. It appears that it's been formulated with something and we don't understand how adding in adjuvants is impacting or reducing the efficacy, but it seems like that's what we've seen. As a direct is a super expensive product. But again, it's one of the only things we have that can be a sort of bomb out product. Again, I would watch out with adjuvants with a product like this and try to go in with it solo. So with that, that's everything that I have for today. I can take some quick questions and we can move on to Andreas.
Okay, Monique, thank you very much. I think we're a little bit over time, so I think we'll need to move on. However, there is, if you have a question for Monique, please write it into the chat and she will answer it. But there is a question in the chat that I think is pretty important considering our current circumstances, and that is, how long after freezing temps should we wait to apply oil? And is there no risk for damage after a frost? And I'll take the first shot at that. And oil should not be applied after a freeze or frost events. It can be phytotoxic, particularly if the foliage is damaged. It will absorb the oil and we will have a problem. So I think at the very least, you have to wait some period of time, maybe even 2 weeks until the foliage is healed to the extent that it would take oil. I suspect Captan might be a similar situation, but any of my colleagues or Monique, you want to comment on this?
I think oil is incredibly sensitive and it's hard to work with. My impression has been, refer back to your consultant and go with what your consultant is comfortable with. They have the most experience on what outcomes and when to and when not to use it. I don't have as much experience with that. So I would defer to your consultant for recommendations on that. But overall, I agree with what Dan said, it does get risky if we've had a freeze, what you're actually doing to the tissue with that. So
thanks, Monique, and thanks for your presentation. Now we'll move on to our final speaker for this webinar, and that is Dr. Andres Antolines Delgado, our entomologist at the Cornell Hudson Valley Lab. He's based in Highland, New York. Andres, take it away and share your screen.
Thank you, Dan. Let me know if you're seeing my my screen now.
You're good.
Okay. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. My presentation today will focus on how the season is progressing, and also I will give some management recommendations, specifically for Eastern New York with an emphasis in the Hudson Valley. Monique already covered the majority of the insects in a very good presentation, so that will help me to go probably faster. So we had a quick start this season. In this table, I have a comparison of the degree accumulations from January 1st to April 18 in the last 5 years. So we have years from the 2022 to 2026. And in this column, in the first column, we have temperatures base 43 Fahrenheit and base 50 Fahrenheit. And if we see the temperatures base 43, we can see that in 2026, we have accumulated 389 degree days. That's higher than the other years in the table, except 2023. And for base 50, we have accumulated 234 degree days. And that's higher when you compare to the other years in the table. So we have had very high accumulations of degree days in the base 50 temperature this year. So basically, we arrived to this situation because of last week temperatures. So we have here in this table the temperatures from last Monday to last Friday. And we can see that the highest temperatures were in the range of the 80s. So that was a very hot week with a lot of days clustered in the high temperatures. So that helped us to accumulate a lot of degree days. And actually we passed from tight cluster on Monday to almost bloom on Friday. So pink in the Hudson Valley was really, really quick this season. In this slide, we have the predicted phenology for Eastern New York. So in the mid-Hudson Valley, we are expecting in the Monday of 4/27, we're expecting to be in early petal fall. In the capital region, in 4/27, we're expecting early bloom. And in the Champlain Valley, we're expecting early tight cluster. And this is the forecast for 10 days for the Hudson Valley area, mid-Hudson Valley area. So we are going to have some temperatures in the 60s. And something important is that in the week of 4/27, when we are expecting our petal fall, we're going to have a lot of rainy days. So that's probably, it's something that is going to complicate our petal fall sprays. And you should be paying attention in order to see when is the best window for insecticide applications at petal fall. I am not recommending to wait a lot or to delay your petal fall applications, basically because I am already seeing a lot of plum curculius outside. So the pressure is high this year. So it is definitely not recommendable that you spray, that you delay those petal fall sprays. In this slide, we have a comparison to show the shift in first catch timing for different insects. So we have the first catch in 2025 and the date of the first catch in 2026. For the first two insects, red-banded leaf rollers and speckled green fruit worm, those are always the ones that appear first. There is almost no difference if you compare the first catch in 2025 and 2026. But for lace apple worm, the first catch in 2026 was April 13, and in 2025 was April 21. Oriental fruit moth also appeared early this year. So the first capture was April 17, and in 2025 was April 22. Black stem borer is already flying. The first capture was April 16. And plum curculio, the first capture was on April 15. And in 2025, it was April 28. So this year we are almost 2 weeks early. And one important observation here for plum curculio is that not only it is arriving earlier, but also the numbers that I am seeing in the traps are higher than in 2025. So the populations are already high. One recommendation for the Hudson Valley, specifically, your codling mud traps should be deployed because according to the degree days we have accumulated, it is very likely that we will see the first individuals very soon. I would like to talk also about tarnished plant bug and tarnished plant bug activity. Tarnished plant bug activity has been high in certain locations in the mid-Hudson Valley. This is a problem that is always like very site-specific. The first observation of a tarnished plant bug this season was April 4, but last week, in this very hot week, I definitely observed a higher number of tarnished plant bugs, so they are already active. In this slide, I would like to show an old study, but a very cool study that was published by Prokopi in 1981. In this study, they evaluated the susceptibility of the different apple parts in different parts of the season. So they took branches from silver tip almost to 12 weeks after petal fall, and they evaluated how susceptible they were to tarnished plant bug damage. So in the table, we have the number of dimpled fruit and the number of fruit with scabs. And in this part, we have the total of the damage caused. And as we can see in this table, tarnished plant bug damage is concentrated between late pink and 2 weeks after petal fall. That's where the majority of the damage of tarnished plant bug is concentrated. So if the insect attacks very early at green tip or if it attacks very late, that damage is negligible. But the most important damage is between pink and 2 weeks after petal fall. So that's the timing that you need to pay attention in order to do an insecticide spray if you have to. So we have this insecticide spray window that is basically between pink and first cover. And what the majority of the people do is that they spray here at pink. So they usually spray a pyrethroid. And then one important thing, and sometimes the spray programs may fail, is that the second spray will be petal fall. But in petal fall, you are more worried about plum curculio than tarnished plant bug. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't be worried about plum curculio. Definitely, plum curculio is the most important pest that you need to control at petal fall. But my point is that if you only pay attention to plum curculio, and you don't pay attention to still tarnished plant bug, your spray program may fail. So my point is that here you should include an insecticide that covers both insects. For example, the common approach to use a bond for plum curculio at petal fall, in the majority of cases work, but if you have also a very high tarnished plant bug population, it's not going to work that well for tarnished plant bug because a bond is weak in the control for tarnished plant bug. So if you have both insects at the same time, you should spray something more like Actara that maybe it can provide you better control for both, or you can use a pre-mix. You can use compounds like Gladiator, which is a mix between Mustang Max and Abamectin, or you can use Indigo, which is a mix between Warrior 2 and Actara. So you can use those insecticides that are pre-mixes in order to hit the two insects at the same time. Special recommendations about black stem borer management. They are already flying, as I already mentioned, and because of that, the traps should be deployed now. One probably advantage that we will have in the next week is that temperatures are going to decrease a little bit, and also there is going to be a lot of rain. So usually they don't go outside to fly when it's raining. So that's going to be an advantage. However, the disadvantage is that if it is going to be raining, and if you have a place where the drainage is not good, maybe that will stress the tree. And then when you see the population peak of the stem borers, they will arrive and they may attack those trees if they are stressed. So you need to monitor to see the increases in trap catches to optimize your timings in order to do your insecticide sprays. Remember that the only way to have right now in order to control black stem borer damage is to do trunk sprays. And there are only two products labeled, Warrior 2 and Danitol. And take into account that the flag activity is higher, above 70 Fahrenheit and close to 75% of relative humidity. That's all I have today, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Andres. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. If you have a question for Andres, please reach out to him or put the question in the chat. Craig, if I might make two quick recommendations to the group before we break.
Certainly.
And the first is a reminder that full pink to late pink is the proper timing for prohexadione calcium or apogee or kudos. At pink for the suppression of bitter pit and honeycrisp, the rate is 6 ounces per acre. For my Hudson Valley growers, especially in Ulster County, where we're already into bloom, I still would say go for it. Thursday is your day. I like to have a little heat. It's going to be 65 degrees on Thursday. That's going to be your timing. The second recommendation, especially considering our situation with frost damage and potential losses, is the use of a range PGR, gibberellins G7, for the suppression of return bloom in honeycrisp for next year. My concern is that the cold, if it takes out enough of your crop that you have less than 50% of a crop in your honeycrisp, you're at risk of snowball bloom next year. The last thing you want to do is get on that slippery slope of biennial bearing in honeycrisp. So the gibberellins in a range, 100 parts per million, 1 gallon per 100 gallons applied per acre. The timing is between petal fall and 14 days post petal fall. So you could wait to see what you have for fruit set, before you decide to do this, but it will provide some suppression, significant suppression of return bloom. I'm in the 6th year of a long-term study. It's the last year of it and having really good results. So I'll write about it in the e-alert, in an upcoming e-alert. You'll get more details. But with that, Craig, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dan. I really want to thank all the speakers, and I want to thank Mike and Dan and Janet and Mario and Liz. They're really the brains behind putting this together. Dan lit a fire under our butts because phenology was advancing so fast in the Hudson Valley. In previous years, we've done this the last few days of April, I think, or even May 1st. So with that, I thank you all. These will be edited soon and posted on both of our team's YouTube channels, the Lake Ontario Fruit Team and Eastern New York Commercial Hort Program. Looks like we don't have any more questions, so I think we can all sign off. Thank you, folks.
Thank you, Craig.